Bushido, the Japanese way of the warrior, is an idea of great self-discipline and a code of honor first adopted by the samurai in pre-modern Japan. This then evolved into an ethical code that permeated throughout Japanese society. Bushido takes many forms, but also has stringent rules that are non-negotiable. Obedience to a superior is expected no matter what the circumstances are. This combination of honor and discipline made Japanese soldiers formidable in World War II. They would fight to the last man, often in suicide charges, and endure hardships that were unique to Western minds. Battles like Tarawa or Iwo Jima and Saipan are examples of Japanese soldiers refusing to surrender and nearly being wiped out. And sometimes the last order given was the command obeyed for the longest time. That was the case with Hiroo Onoda, one of the last Japanese warriors of World War II to surrender. Onoda spent almost 30 years after the end of the war hiding out in the jungles of the Philippines, not realizing the war had ended. Onoda was born on March 19, 1922 in a village located in the Wakayama prefecture of Japan. There was nothing particularly spectacular about his upbringing. Instead, he was an ordinary Japanese boy living in a time when the emperor was revered as a god and the Japanese were dedicated to a life of discipline and honor. Onoda was 18 years old when he enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Army's infantry. He joined the military at a time of notable change in Asia. Japan had altered the face of the southeastern portion of the continent. In 2 years, from 1940 to 1942, they had defeated Southeast Asia's British, French, American, and Dutch colonial powers. After which, Japan attempted to create a new Asia with its Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and the young recruit was a part of all of this. Onoda was trained as an intelligence officer in a commando class at the Nakano School. This training center specialized in guerrilla warfare, propaganda, and counterintelligence. Little did he know at the time how essential this military education would be for his later survival. His military duty was fairly routine until December 26, 1944, when he was assigned to Lubang Island. His orders instructed Onoda to do whatever was possible to frustrate any attacks to the Americans on the island, including destroying enemy supplies and damaging the harbor. But unfortunately, these instructions of his superiors also carried directives that would determine the next 30 years of his life. Onoda's orders stipulated that he was not to surrender under any circumstances and was denied the privilege of taking his own life. American and Filipino forces landed on Lubang Island on February 28, 1945. It did not take long before they had the upper hand. Except for Onoda and 3 other soldiers, the Japanese garrison on the island was either killed or surrendered. By this time, Onoda was a lieutenant, and he ordered the other men to escape with him into the mountains in the interior of Lubang. This began a saga that stretched out for years, which then stretched to decades. Onoda and his men went into the bush intending to carry out sabotage. There were Japanese soldiers still roaming around Southeast Asia after Japan's formal surrender. Efforts were made to contact these men and let them know the war was over. Such attempts were primary leaflets dropped from planes. Onoda and his men thought the information was fake, did not believe anything about Japan's surrender. Search parties with Japanese participants were organized to find them, but Onoda thought that those were Japanese prisoners that had been forced to try and locate them. Newspapers were dismissed as propaganda, and when the Korean War started and jets flew over Lubang, Onoda and the others thought they were a Japanese counteroffensive. These men were so committed to their final orders, they believed nothing except their idea that war was continuing. So how do they survive in the jungle? Well, they became survivalists. They lived on a diet of coconuts, banana skins, and what rice they could steal. The strict military obedience they had followed required them to live among snakes and stinging insects for years. They were doing more than just hiding. Onoda's orders were to attack the enemy, and that is what he did. He and his men killed farmers and had shootouts with the police throughout the years. Gradually, however, the band fell apart. 2 of the men were killed, and 1 just simply walked away and surrendered to the Philippine Army. By 1972, Hiroo Onoda was the only one left. Despite that, he continued to act aggressively against the Philippine government as if the war had never ended. Finally, Onoda's battle against modern time ended thanks to a man named Norio Suzuki, who was a Japanese explorer and adventurer. The authorities knew about Onoda from the Japanese soldier who had deserted earlier, and Suzuki went looking for him. He finally found him hiding in the jungle, wearing a badly tattered military uniform. Suzuki told him that the war was over, and it was time to come out into the open. Onoda responded that he would not give up what he was doing or leave the island until he was formally relieved of his duty by a superior officer. To arrange that, Suzuki returned to Japan and told astonished listeners that Hiroo Onoda was still alive and carrying on as a soldier. Therefore, finding an officer from World War II who could give him the official order to stand down was necessary. Suzuki and the others stumbled onto an incredible piece of luck. They found his commanding officer, a man named Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. The man was still alive and living a quiet life as a bookseller. The Japanese government flew him to the Philippines, and from there he was taken to Lubang Island. On March 9th, 1974, in a forest clearing on the islands, Taniguchi presented to Hiroo Onoda a formal order to stand down. Onoda handed over his Arisaka Type 99 bolt-action rifle, his remaining ammunition, grenades, and his knife. He was flown to Manila, where he was presented his sword to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos. His personal war, carried on in the jungles of the Philippines, was finally over. President Marcos accepted his surrender and formally pardoned Onoda for anything he had done during those years he was fighting in the jungle. Onoda was now free to go home when he returned to Japan. He came home to a hero's welcome, but he was unhappy with the state in which he saw modern Japan. He left for Brazil and became a cattle rancher before returning to Japan in 1984 and establishing a school for troubled children. Onoda was the product of a military training and indoctrination that expected blind obedience and devotion to duty. He commented in his memoirs that Japanese soldiers were expected to die for the cause, and there would be repercussions for anybody who did not adhere to traditional standards. This did not mean just execution. Soldiers who failed to live up to the military codes of honor were ostracized. The demands placed on the ordinary Japanese soldier were severe. Soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army were expected to fight until they died if necessary. Those expectations explain why the war in the Pacific was so brutal. The casualties suffered by the Japanese during the war were massive. The Battle of Tarawa, for example, ended with only 17 Japanese soldiers being captured. The rest of the garrison were either killed or committed suicide. The Battle of Saipan saw a garrison of approximately 29,000 Japanese soldiers completely wiped out. 24,000 were killed in action, and another 5,000 killed themselves. Garrisons of Japanese soldiers were decimated routinely in other Pacific Island battles, as the soldiers kept fighting even though they knew there was no chance of winning. The possibility that near suicidal resistance would happen if the Allies invaded the Japanese home islands was a reason given when dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's possible, even likely, that Onoda committed some war crimes by killing innocent civilians. There were allegations that Onoda and his men killed as many as 30 Lubang Islanders. The deaths included decapitation. There were two major films that were based on Onoda's experiences and his memoirs. They included accusations of indiscriminate killing of innocent farmers. The films served to counterbalance the press coverage of Onoda after his surrender. A professor of foreign studies at Tokyo University, for example, commented on the documentaries and agreed that the gruesome side of what Onoda did needed to be discussed. The islanders had hated the man because they knew he had meant harm. Onoda defended his actions by maintaining that he sincerely believed the war was still being fought and that he was a combatant. Despite any criticism of what he did, he was formally pardoned and there was no legal action taken against him. He died on January 16, 2014 at 91 years of age. He was not the last Japanese soldier to surrender. A man named Teruo Nakamura continued his actions of resistance in the Indonesian jungles until a few months after Onoda came out of hiding. Nakamura would then lay down his weapons and end his years of fighting for the emperor. He was officially the last Japanese soldier to give up fighting. Nearly 30 years after the formal surrender of Japan, the Japanese Imperial Army was finally no more.